In this week's Parsha Vayeira, one of the most fascinating and compelling stories is the argument between Avraham and Hashem. I don't know if argument's the right word, is where Avraham tries to convince Hashem to spare the cities of Sdom. That Hashem tells Avraham that the nation is very wicked, that they are behaving in a despicable fashion, and in fact he is going to destroy them. And I'd like to share a few insights on the story. Avraham responds, pleading for clemency and for Hashem to spare them. Eventually, he is unable to succeed, even though Hashem agrees that if there would be a certain number of righteous people, the city would be saved. There is not a sufficient number of righteous people. So this comes throughout chapter 18, Perek Yud Chet. And the first insight is that Hashem says in Pasuk Chaf in verse 20, Vayomer Hashem, and Hashem said, Zakat Sdom ve'Amorah, the cry of Sdom and Amorah, ki rabbah, because it is great, v'chatatam, and their sin, ki kavda me'od, because it is very heavy, erdana ve'ereh hakatzakata, I will go down and see, is this indeed the case, etc. But it's interesting because there's an extra because over here. It should just be, the cry of Sdom ve'Amorah is great. And their sin, because it is so heavy, I'm going to go down and see, and if indeed this is the case, I will destroy them. But what does it mean, the cry of Sdom and Amorah? Because it is great. So the Maggid of Dubno explains this using one of his famous stories, that he says, if you have a person who lives a very pampered life, a person who is always pain-free and always has the best of everything and never has anything to worry about, he says, and then they start crying out from pain. He says, you don't always take it so seriously, because so what they consider to be great pain, many people live with on a daily basis, and this is simply a person who's unused to dealing with pain. However, he says, what if you have someone who lives a very difficult life, who lives a very uncomfortable life, who experiences a great deal of pain, and they start crying out from the pain? Then he says, you know that it's serious. When it comes to a regular city that cries out about injustice, okay, so if Switzerland would cry out about corruption, right, maybe because, there's 1% corruption. You have other countries, he says, if you have a corrupt dictatorship that cries out about corruption, then you know that there's really a problem. He says if the city of Sdom is crying out about the injustice, the city of Sdom where every resident was an evil person virtually, if they were crying about injustice, then he says, then you know. So the way you read the pasuk, the Maggid says is, Zakat Sdom ve'Amorah ki rabbah, the cry of Sdom and Amorah, because it is great, because even they are crying. V'chatatam ki kavda me'od, therefore their sin, because it's so heavy, therefore it's worthy of destruction. If even such evil and corrupt people have seen that this has gone too far, then certainly action is needed to be taken. And Avraham v'yigash Avraham v'yomar, and Avraham approaches and he says, Ha'af tispeh tzadikim rasha, will the righteous be destroyed with the wicked? Ulai yesh 50 tzadikim b'toch ha'ir, perhaps there are 50 righteous people in the midst of the city. So then please Hashem, save the whole city. So there's a couple of things that are interesting. One is, Hashem does not say if there are 50 righteous people, save the righteous people. It seems to be taken for granted that the righteous people will be saved. The question is, if there are 50 righteous people, spare the entire city. And then what I think it's the Meshech Chochmah points out over here, two words which indicate something very important, is that he says, Ulai yesh 50 tzadikim b'toch ha'ir. Perhaps there are 50 righteous people in the midst of the city. He doesn't just say 50 righteous people in the city, 50 righteous people in the midst of the city, within the city. What difference does that make? He says if you have 50 righteous people in the midst of the city, they can have an influence on everyone else. If you have 50 righteous people who are integrated into life in the community, then there is hope not only for them but for everyone. If those 50 righteous people are in the city, but are not b'toch ha'ir, but are not involved in the city, if they're making their own little place and not really connected to, involved in, committed to the life of the rest of the inhabitants, then he says, then the 50 righteous people cannot save the rest of the city. It's only when they exist within themselves and they're committed to others. But it's interesting because you still need a critical mass. Don't assume that you can be a righteous person in the midst of an entire city, that you'll be righteous and they'll all be wicked and it'll be fine. Doesn't work like that. You need a nucleus. You need a community. You need the minimum that Avraham says, which is 10. You need those 10 people. Then you can have a group that can influence the entire city. But once you drop below that critical mass, then even those 10 people are going to be in trouble. Again, they may be saved, but they shouldn't be too confident that this is a way to do it. Now, Avraham continues speaking to Hashem, and later on he says, V'yan is in Pasuk Chaf Zayin 27, V'yan Avraham v'yomer, and Avraham answers and says, Hinei na ho'alti ledaber el Adonai v'anochi afar v'evar. And behold, I have desired, or I've begun to speak to my master, to God, but I am just dust and ashes. In other words, he's coming and saying, he's very aware of the discrepancy that's going on over here. That you have a human being questioning and challenging the Holy One, blessed be He, the Creator of heaven and earth. And so Avraham is making it clear that he is coming here with a humility, with a sense of the dynamics of what's really going on. He says, Hashem, I want you to understand. I want to talk to you about this, but please, I know for myself that I need to bear in mind that I am dust and ashes. I'm a human being. I'm not important. It's not fitting of me to challenge you, but nonetheless, this is a question that I have. So that being the case, Avraham uses this expression of being dust and ashes as a way to show his humility. And the Midrash says something very interesting. Because Avraham said this very humble and beautiful statement of I'm but dust and ashes, Hashem gave the Jewish people a mitzvah relating to the dust and a mitzvah relating to ashes. What are they? The mitzvah relating to the dust is the dust that was given to the sotah, the wife suspected of adultery, to restore peace between her and her husband. When there is circumstantial evidence that a woman's committed adultery, so the whole story goes, she goes off to the temple, as we read in Parshat Naso, later on in the book of Bamidbar. So they test. The way you do the test is you take a parchment with the section written on it, and you take earth from the floor of the temple, dust from the floor of the temple. You put those together into water, the text on the parchment dissolves, she drinks that water. Now that dust, which is used in a mitzvah, the Midrash says is given because of the merit of Avraham, and the ashes refers to the para aduma, the red cow, that when you had a completely red cow, as you read in Parshat Chukat, the cow was shechted, it was burnt, those ashes were dissolved in water, and that was used to purify from contact with the dead. So the Maggid of Dubna again asks, what is the connection here that Avraham says he uses humility, says he's dust and ashes, so Hashem gives us mitzvah of the dust and the ashes. So he explains it with a story that he says there is a great honored dignitary at a certain function who's been given a place at the main table. However, this is a very humble person. And so rather than going up to the main table and seating himself there, he decides he's going to sit at the back. He sits at a table at the corner in the back. The host who sees this taking place, the host gets up and comes over and brings with him all of the other dignitaries, and they go and sit at this table in the corner, making that into the main table. That becomes the main table. So the idea is that when a humble person, when a great person associates himself with something humble, in fact the response is that where he is becomes elevated. This great dignitary goes to sit in the corner. That corner becomes the main place. Avraham, the Maggid says, Hanochi afar v'efer, I'm dust and ashes. This great holy person, Avraham, associates himself with the dust and ashes. The dust and ashes themselves become holy. You never have to worry about humility dragging you down. You never have to worry that you have to put yourself out there and become great and worry about your... If you have that holiness and greatness within you, wherever you go will become elevated. You carry that holiness with you. It's not something that you have to impose upon or use to impress others. Have a wonderful Shabbos.